Yes. Hello, everyone who joined us today. My name is Olena Carbou from Ukrainian think tank Liaison office in Brussels. And today we are organizing already the second webinar connected to the Eastern Partnership countries. When the first webinar we devoted to the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 on Eastern Partnership countries, today we decided to speak and to focus on the political implications of the COVID-19 on the Eastern Partnership region. And together with our partners, the 3 DCFTA projects, in cooperation with the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum and with the support of Government of Sweden and International Renaissance Foundation, we are happy to welcome you all today at our webinar. Political implications, this is an important question, especially given the fact that the Eastern Partnership countries are diverse in their political system and they combine semi-democratic or autocratic regimes. And this webinar, apart from this regional aspect, it also has global implications, because since COVID-19 has started, the question who battle, who fights, and who is coping with this problem better, democracies, autocracies, is quite very weird, quite important question. And together with our experts, panelists, discussants today, we will try to make our input into this global discussion. Before I give the floor to my co-moderator, Michael Emerson, I would like to give some technical details on how we will build today's discussion. And this is with regard the Q&A session and your involvement into discussion today, which we, of course, encourage. So the first and the main kind of rule and suggestion for today's discussion is that if you have a very specific question devoted to a specific concrete country, please try to put it just right after the speaker from this country is speaking, and we will try to get it inside of the session when panelists are presenting their interventions. Otherwise, we will collect the questions, your comments in the Q&A session, which will go after the panelist will speak. And when you address your question, please specify the panelist you would like to ask, if it is country related, or if you have a general question to all Eastern Partnership countries, also specify this as well. So with this, I would give a floor now to Michael to actually guide us together with the panelists over this overview of political picture, of political scene right now, and how COVID-19 indeed impacted or not, and is it soon or not soon to make any forecasts, any assessments of the situation. Michael, the floor is yours now. And just for all of you, we may disappear from the screens to give more to let our speakers to present their countries. Michael, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Olena, and greetings to everybody, especially those we can't see. But right, we're discussing the political implications of this momentous coronavirus pandemic. I begin by quoting Chu Enlai, who is reputed to have said of the political implications of the French Revolution that it's too early to say. So I think that applies to us, but still we've got to try. That's what we're going to do. So here we are with 4 semi-democracies and 2 outright autocracies. okay, we're looking for any evidence as to who's performing best. It's clear that the two autocracies are performing badly and have lost public support. But there's no real change in the status quo appearing as of now on the horizon there. And of the semi-democracies, only Georgia has performed well. And as for the others, our colleagues are describing their performance as somewhere between the incompetent and the disastrous. Oh dear. Anyway, we have elections coming up, both the presidency of Belarus in August and for the parliament of Georgia in October, which will be very interesting because these are two polar cases. Right. Let's go into hear from our distinguished panel. Let us go from east to west. To start with Georgia and Tbilisi, then go on to Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then work our way up west, Moldova, Ukraine, and finally to Belarus. This allows us to bracket the whole debate between Georgia, which managed very well and is more or less a democracy, through to Belarus, which is an exceptional example of not having tried seriously even to constrain the pandemic, and is an outright autocracy. And so in the middle, the intermediate cases, and let us go straight then to Tamara Kovziridze in Tbilisi. Tamara, question for you. Does this favorable performance by your government, does this mean good news for them when they go to the elections in October, despite growing unease over the role of the informally ruling oligarch Ivanishvili? Tamara, over to you.
Thank you, Michael and Olena, for the introduction. And I would like to welcome all the attendees to our today's webinar. I think this is $1 million question, Michael, and there is probably there is a variety of answers and opinions about that. And at this moment, we can only speculate because since the COVID outbreak took place, there have been no public opinion polls that would give us at least the possibility to approximately evaluate which parties and political forces lost and gained as a result. But nevertheless, I will try to describe the situation as it stands now, and explain the details around it. So I will start with the situation prior to the COVID, and at that point in time, at the beginning of 2020, we had a situation where the political landscape was considerably polarized. On the one hand, we had a growing attempt by the opposition parties to try and unite against the governance and shadow governance by the oligarch Ivanishvili, and growing discontent about the government's policies favorable towards Russia. We had at the same time decreasing popularity of the government, especially in the follow-up of the so-called Gavrilov's Night, which took place last year in June, and which triggered a huge mobilization, demonstrations, and movements against the government, most notably among the youth, which was a new feature and development in the process of political protest. And we had a situation where governing party on the one hand and the opposition parties on the other hand were trying to agree on a compromise about the new electoral system for the upcoming general elections. and about the release of the political prisoners, because at that point in time, several key opposition political figures, leaders of opposition parties, a founder of the opposition TV channel were in prison. Finally, the agreement was brokered with the support of the EU, US, and German ambassadors, and it was agreed that the electoral system would be changed. There would be 30 majoritarian MPs, and the remaining 120 seats would be distributed based on the proportional system. This was the demand of the opposition to increase the number of proportional representation, because as a rule, majoritarian MPs are under the stronger influence by the governing party, and this has been the case for the past years, and there was a very strong and united demand to release political prisoners. At that moment, when the popularity of government was low, there was disagreement of the 8th of March in place between the opposition and the government, upcoming elections, October 2020, and then the virus outbreak started. Georgia handled it quite well, especially if we compare it with countries in our region or beyond. It is considered one of the good cases. We just have in total less than 1,000 cases. So as of today, only 931. And the number of deaths is only 15. So overall, it can be concluded that yes, government managed to handle it well as far as the health and safety situation of the population is concerned. But because this happened at the cost of very strict lockdown measures, and also because the exit from the lockdown measures is very careful and slow, we are expecting a very dramatic economic impact of this, and therefore it's definitely unclear what will happen with the popularity of the government. Because, for example, we had economic growth of minus 16.6% in April and over 13% in May, and some very key lockdown measures like closure of international borders and absence of regular flights are still in place and will remain so at least until the 1st of August. And even though the European Union included Georgia in the list of 15 safe countries to which it's possible to fly, Georgia did not reciprocate this step, and our airports and international flights remain closed. So to sum up the performance of the government, it handled the virus part well, but the implications of the virus are going to be quite severe, I think, and then it remains to be seen what happens with government's popularity in this respect. Again, and at the same time, opposition remains united in its request to release political prisoners. Government has done so only partially and has only partially fulfilled the agreement of the 8th of March. So constitutional amendments are adopted. We will have elections according to the new system where it's 120 to 30 in terms of proportional and majoritarian MPs. But the part on the release of political prisoners remains unfulfilled fully. So opposition boycotted the voting on the electoral system in the parliament. Generally, as far as the virus part is concerned, there was no particular tension in the society or disagreement with the government how it handled it. Mostly key opposition parties were criticizing the strict lockdown measures, which actually seemed disproportionate to the virus and pandemic situation on the ground. Because as of today, for example, we have not more than 2-3 infection cases daily, but despite this, some key restrictive measures remain in place. And it looks like that the government is afraid to lose situation out of control prior to the elections. It enjoyed the role of being in charge, and it keeps these restrictions in place. So to summarize, we will have to see what happens, but definitely the dynamics are interesting. And just one sentence to add, the government is also increasingly getting under international pressure from our European and US partners, which adds to the domestic pressures from the opposition, which seems to be more united than ever, actually. So I will stop here, not to use too much of our time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait a minute.
I unmuted you, Michael. We have a question regarding the regarding Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Tamara. Two general points I should have mentioned already. For those beyond the screen, I think you have received in the communications an email, a website address of the project, 3DCFTAs.eu. And all of the speakers now have, in the last day or two, submitted extremely interesting short written contributions on the basis of which they're now speaking. And all of these texts will be available. We'll publish them probably tomorrow. Other general point, 5 minutes for each of the speakers, please, for your initial contributions. Now, Olena, do we have any particular questions for Tamara?
Yes, before I will say, I will remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A window, not the chat, because it's much easier to operate questions from there. Please use Q&A window. The concrete question to Georgia, given this really success of Georgia in facing the COVID-19, the question is, what additional critical or important factors can Georgia attribute its success in this regards to?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one thing was, as I mentioned, the government, that we can say it handled well. The medical staff was actually performing well overall. And what is important is that in total, population complied to the rules that were introduced, the lockdown rules and restrictions. And there were no frequent or major violations, in contrast to some stories that we hear that initially people just disregarded what was happening and they were still organizing large parties and not taking the virus seriously. So I think there are several factors, but the population and society did play a role, which was quite, let's say, respecting the rules. And I think this is an important factor too.
Okay, thank you very much. Let us move on to down the road to Yerevan. Benyamin, we see from the data that Armenia is in big trouble with the resurgence of the number of infections and indeed deaths. And you characterize the handling of this as ranging between the incompetent to the disastrous. Okay, hard words here. Now, what are the political consequences going to be for the leadership or for opposition parties? Over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Michael, and greetings to everyone. Just very briefly about numbers. Yes, despite the fact that Armenia is now in more than 3 months on the emergency situation, which was declared on March 16 and then been extended several times. It will end on July 13, but most probably the government will extend for another 1 month till mid-August. However, we have more than 26,000 infection cases, and just today the death rate past 600. We have this morning 603 cases. And also economic situation is bad, because according to official data, we have 16.3% decline of economic activities for April 2020, and we had 12.8% decline of economic activities for May, and we are waiting for the numbers for June. Regarding the political consequences, first of all, we should take into account that since April-May velvet revolution in Armenia in 2018, for more than 1 year, we have situation when the popularity ratings of the current Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, was really very high. And during Senate parliamentary elections in December 2018, his coalition, MyStep coalition, secured 2/3 majority. And now he has absolute 2/3 or constitutional majority in the parliament. However, even before the outbreak of pandemic in mid-March 2020, there was some decline in his popularity based on several reasons, both objective reasons, because no politician can keep these 70 or 80% high popularity rates, but also due to the issue that there was no significant increase of social economic situation for average citizens, because many supported revolution both because they were tired of this old system, oligarchy, corruption, etc., but also they were tired of their low level of life standards, and there was hope that after the revolution, due to the democratic changes, immediately billions of US dollars of foreign direct investments will pour into Armenia. And also during the revolution, Pashinyan and his supporters were promising that within 6 months or 1 year, they will brought back 7 billion of US dollars of so-called looted property or looted money. And thus, the 7 billion plus possible another billions of foreign direct investments, many people thought that it will significantly increase their life standards within very short time of period. But unfortunately, according to official data, government managed to bring back a little bit more than 100 million US dollar from so-called corruption cases. And also we see very low level of foreign direct investment in Armenia. Even FDI is less now than before revolution. So in January, February 2020, we see the growing decline of popularity of Prime Minister and his coalition. Then came this coronavirus. And as all we know, unfortunately, Armenian numbers are a very bad one. And this toughened the stance of opposition parties. And starting from the beginning of June, several opposition parties, including the biggest opposition party, they started to demand the resignation of Prime Minister and the change of whole government, accusing the government of lacking the basic capacities for crisis management rules. Then the situation became more complicated. National Security Service launched criminal cases against the leader of this biggest opposition party, also former or current oligarch and tycoon, Mr. Kovziridze, who is also a member of parliament. Then the national parliament, by the votes of MyStep coalition, which supports Pashinyan, deprived this member of parliament from his immunity. And despite the fact that the court of first line rejected the National Security Service demand to arrest him, but now we are waiting for another court trial regarding the possibility of arrest of this MP, and also the criminal investigation is going on. Plus, the government scheduled on April 5 the constitutional amendment referendum, which would allow him to fire those judges of constitutional court who were appointed before the Velvet Revolution, as government accused them of being the servants of former corrupted oligarchic elites. But due to coronavirus and the national emergency situation, the government had to postpone the referendum. And then he decided to make this constitutional amendment via National Assembly. And on June 22, National Assembly, within several hours, changed the one article of Constitution and fired 3 judges of Constitutional Court. But opposition now claims that these changes were unconstitutional because, according to the Constitution, National Assembly should receive the consent of Constitutional Court regarding the constitutionality of the draft amendments. So now we also are in a somehow constitutional crisis because the opposition argues that these 3 constitutional judges still are effective judges, but the executive branch, part of National Assembly, and also the Prime Minister argues that these 3 judges are fired, and the National Assembly should elect new judges. Regarding the prospects, very briefly, situation is this way that yes, many people now are disappointed from Prime Minister, but also there is no other political actor who can be lead this part of this population. So we have decline of Prime Minister popularity, but also there are no other real opposition figure who can compete with Prime Minister. So situation is this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Olena, do we have anything special there? No? Okay. Well, let's move on across to Baku. Shahla, we share with you what your emotions must be due to the record-breaking fast rise of infections that Azerbaijan is now experiencing, the fastest in the whole of the region. So it must be very tough for you, even if you may be well okay, you must be terribly worried. So the question to you is, Azerbaijan Inc. is in big trouble here, also for the oil price reason. Is the regime going to be seriously challenged as a result, or are oppressive measures going to be intensified, or what? No sound. You're muted.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Good
Yeah.
afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be sharing this webinar with you today and being among the panelists. Well, indeed, the situation in Azerbaijan is getting more and more challenging because despite of a very strict prevention measures, the number of newly infected people has been rising rapidly and daily. In the last 2 weeks, we have been having between 500 and 600, the number of newly infected people, which is 12, 13 times more as big as we had, let's say, in April and May when we had the strict lockdown, similar to what we are having now. So we are actually having the second round of the strict lockdown, starting from 21st of June and ending minimum on the 5th of July, but there are already the talks that most probably this regime will be prolonged for another 2 weeks. So it means that the situation with COVID is not really good. But coming back to your question, of course, this situation is challenging the government's stability inside the country a lot. And this process hasn't started right now. It's not related only with the COVID situation. The thing is that Azerbaijan has had the long track record of political challenges in the past few years, and despite of huge oil revenues in the last decade, there was lack of diversification of economy. There were challenges in regards to the political liberties in the country. Media was suppressed a lot. Civil society organizations practically had an unprecedented crackdown since 2014, and nothing has changed. The donor institutions cannot operate in Azerbaijan anymore, and the international organizations cannot do it either. So we are having, quite different levels of challenges, and also political opponents and political parties, from those which are from opposition could be regarded as opposition, they are also being suppressed for quite a long time. And taking into account that we do not have a good track of fair and democratic elections for quite a few years, I would say that it all compiled into a very difficult situation in general. So COVID actually brought up a lot to this context, meaning that a lot of things were unveiled and discovered and disclosed in the way. Basically, a lot of, that we have very high rates of corruption inside the country, and the corruption has damaged a lot of sectors, but it has become very visible for even non-political and ordinary people to what extent the corruption has touched the the sectors when COVID started, because, for example, the healthcare sector is practically not incapable to serve the people who are non-corona people, and the same. There were the challenges with the education system once we switched on online system, and then with communication and technologies, because the internet connection was not of the good quality, so there was not a smooth transition to the teleworking immediately, etc. Like we have had all these previously, but people tempted sort of to escape from or close their eyes to that, trying to find alternative solutions. For example, if someone was sick, he or she was more likely to go to the neighboring country to get the medical treatment there, or diagnosis. And actually the number of health tourists, how we call them, in all the previous years, in the past few years, it was exceeding 250,000 people. So it's 250,000 people who are seeking for the medical service outside of the country. And these people are now blocked inside the country because the borders are closed, and these people are unserved. There's big negligence and malpractice towards them, and that of course aggravates the situation. In addition, of course, during the COVID times, we have had practically almost 3 months of strict lockdown period, and during this period there was some support given to the financial support to entrepreneurs, for example, to poor people. However, the amount and the length of the support was not substantial and proportionate enough to the needs of population. That also was a big trouble for both the population, but also in terms of the perception of the government. The people were disappointed with the entire policy. And if we add up to this, to what extent the civil society organizations are unable to contribute to the prevention and response of COVID circumstances, or unmet needs in relation to COVID. Now, as I already mentioned, we have had the crackdown since 2014, when the entire NGO sector has been damaged to the extent that very few organizations are capable to operate, as independently as they used to. And it was not only about the legal environment, which was the main point which was changed. It was also about the organizational capacities, financial viability, public image, service provision. So all these dimensions which are so important for sustainability of the civil society. And once it was damaged, of course, the organizations and the crisis of COVID were not there to help out the government and to be next to it when it comes to awareness raising necessities and about the monitoring or reporting or prevention of the fake information spread, etc. So all those roles and missions which the civil society is undertaking in different countries, and which we are seeing and admiring, it is absent in Azerbaijan, and this is why the government actually, I think that it should lack this support as well. Yet nothing changes, and although this new situation creates a momentum, but that's a different point, that we are trying to keep the advocacy at the highest level to ensure that the shrunk civil society space is a little bit extended so that it gives us the space to work, to continue our operations in dignity as we used to do before 2014. When it comes to additional irritating factor of the government, I would think that the lack of the information regarding the decisions, how they are taking in relation to COVID, and no clear information who is on the board of these operational headquarters. It is one of the most irritating points, because although people obey to the best of their understanding to these quarantine rules, still a very big question mark is to what extent we really need these strict rules. So I think that engaging the public people and well-respected people would help advancing the both understanding and recognition of the necessity of these steps. I can elaborate more on now that we are having time restrictions, so I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahla. Olena, any specific questions here?
No specific question to Armenia, and I encourage again the participants to put their question in the Q&A window.
To Azerbaijan. What about Azerbaijan? Questions to Azerbaijan?
Okay, right. Well, let's move on to Moldova. Denis, we see you there. We see that the pandemic is not under control. Infections still rising very fast. We see this adds to a situation of chronic political instability. We are wondering whether the socialist Dodon presidency are going to suffer politically as a result, and if so, who might gain? I know Moldovan politics are deliciously complicated, but still I hope you will help us see clearly. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I will try to really check my time, because I know that sometimes I may speak longer. The situation in Moldova is very interesting from from several points of view. First of all, Moldova has a political landscape which is geopolitically divided. So we don't speak only about political parties that have different political agendas and are trying to attract different segments of the society, but also about political parties which are advancing different external relations with the external partners. So therefore, the complications get a geopolitical nuance as well. So before COVID-19 started, it was clear that the socialists need partners in the parliament in order to be able to govern in a smoother way, because just one party with 37 MPs is not enough in order to promote laws and to make sure that Igor Dodon can win the second mandate, because this is one of the key goals of the socialists in the government and in the parliament. So when the COVID-19 pandemic started, the socialists were already on their way to create a partnership, a political partnership coalition with the Democratic Party. As maybe some of the attendees and my colleagues know, this is the party that had very good connections, very close connection, intimate connection with the fugitive oligarch Vladimir Plahotniuk. And so this party started to distance itself from the oligarchic influence that it had in the past, by creating a coalition with the socialists. Unfortunately, this was a very short moment of euphoria, because some different groups from inside the Democratic Party started to leave the party. We have different rumors about how those MPs started to leave the party. It's about corruption, it's about bribing. Somebody even mentioned 6 zeros involved in all these transactions with MPs. So the weakening of the coalition that was built by the socialists in order to reach the presidential elections, which are scheduled for 1st of November this year, was somehow too positive and too optimistic, because their partners started to get weaker, and the parliament composition started to become more fragmented. So now in the parliament we have one more parliamentary group. We have 2 parties which are forming the coalition. Then we have the political group which is called Pro-Moldova, that is formed by people who defected the Democratic Party through corrupt methods. This is not yet proved by the prosecutor office, but already there are some requests to the prosecutor office in order to check if such allegations are true or not. And then we have another political party which is run by another fugitive oligarch who is currently residing in Israel. It's Ilan Shor. So it's a very nice, not really democratic composition of the parliament. Therefore, the voice or the idea that the parliament should be dismissed and new elections should take place is growing, but this is not a possible scenario. Because we have presidential elections, and before that, 6 months before that, and after that, and meanwhile, new early parliamentary elections cannot take place. So apart from having a very fragile coalition in the parliament, which has right now about 50 votes, we also speak about presidential elections, which most probably will be very complicated for the incumbent president, because he is accused of not only of being very close to the fugitive oligarch who last year was transmitting him packages of bags with allegedly with money for the financing of the Socialist Party, but Dodon is also very close to Kremlin. So he has two big issues to solve and to convince the electorate that he is the right candidate to be voted again for. And he's the counter candidate is growing in the popularity. We speak about ex-Prime Minister Maia Sandu. She is very much supported by the European institutions, by the pan-European political parties like the European People's Party. They are sending supportive messages to her, and they are criticizing very much the activity of the government, not only in providing reforms but also in managing the pandemic, which is slightly saying incompetent, but the opposition is even calling it catastrophic government. So we have an initiative inside the opposition parties is not supported by all the political parties in the parliament, those which are in opposition. And here I will end my input. So there is an initiative about triggering the fall of the government and installing a government which would be called of national salvation, that will be very much focused on containing the virus, attracting external finances in order to stabilize the budget, as well as for immediate needs to support the healthcare system, agriculture sector, because Moldova is also facing serious natural disasters, and to provide the necessary funds for the small and medium enterprises. So I'm ready to answer your questions, but the issue is not easy at all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Denis. Olena, any specifics for Denis?
No specific question on Moldova.
No. Okay, so we go up the road to Kiev. Veronika, hello.
Hi, Michael. Hi, everybody.
I was just going to say your per capita infections remain quite moderate and low, but they're rising fast. So the question is Ukraine moving into, with some delay, into more deeply troubled waters? The Zelensky honeymoon is certainly over already, but opposition forces, do they take shape and direction? Over to you.
Thank you for these questions. Yeah, and you took this phrase, honeymoon of Zelensky is over, just from my head. I wanted to start like this. So yeah, first about virus. Indeed, the number of cases last week was very high. It was over 1,000 for first time during the pandemic, but it's still unclear whether it's because we have much higher tests now and just more cases are detected, or we are entering in something like a strong growth of cases. Last several days, the number of cases reduced again to the level that we observed in April, May. So my feeling that we have the infection here, and after we switched from the strong lockdown to something like what is called adaptive lockdown, that's something, some oblasts, some more closed, some more open, but still the economic activity resumed and mobility resumed, we will see these infections staying at this level at least for some time. For example, it's expected that Kyiv will enter into stricter lockdown coming days because, yeah, the number of cases is growing. But yeah, nothing terribly bad. But even this shock, it had a very strong implications for the economy, as we discussed, and the political situation in the country. Basically, the Zelensky, the last two polls reported this week showed that Zelensky lost the support of the majority of population now, but it still he has quite high ratings, about 38-40% of people support him, but about 45 already do not support and do not approve his policy. Basically, what we have now, we have a quite difficult political time for government. We had this change in the government on March 4, just before Ukraine entered into the pandemic crisis. The reason for changing the government after only half a year after it was appointed is basically political. It's nothing bad what they did. They just started reforms and it was abruptly stopped. After that, we don't have a stable government. We have already the second Ministry of Health, and still we have a big scandals in the Ministry of Healthcare related to public procurement and alleged corruption. There's major delays in the purchases of tests, protective equipment, etc. We have huge scandal now with the newly appointed acting Minister of Education, because he is accused of plagiarism, and the Verkhovna Rada refused to appoint him, and then the government, on the request of Zelensky, appointed him as an acting director. We have absolutely terrible scandals regarding the Arsene Avakov Ministry of Interior, because we had some very ugly rape story and some other not very pleasant stories about police beating journalists, and despite that he is staying absolutely intact and not responding to any accusation. So basically the government is very, very shaky, and just last week the parliament for the second time refused to vote for the program of activities of the cabinet of ministers. The program is supposedly this like a roadmap for the government for 1 year, given like presumption that it cannot be fired. It can be, as the previous government demonstrated, but at least it's assumed like this. Parliament did not support the program, so we expect a change in the government within a couple of months, likely in autumn. Parliament is also in disarray. We do not have now unambiguous majority of the servants of people. So they now have to collaborate on different laws, with different political forces, sometimes pro-European, sometimes the opposition bloc representing pro-Russian forces. Formally, coalition is there, one-party coalition, but de facto does not exist. We have growing criminal cases against activists and against Poroshenko, now the opposition leader. Just today we have a new scandal that our prosecutor general, she taped video suggesting that Poroshenko, the former president, to came to the court and prove his innocence. Sounds a bit strange because we have in the constitution presumption of innocence, so it should be somehow vice versa. And yeah, we have cases, as I said, about not only opposition leaders but also about activists. We have several cases of beating media representatives. Plus, we have the situation. Just a second. One more piece is that the situation that media, the Zelensky does not want to see media who do not support him. So they're not just accredited for his events. And finally, civil society. We have a now growing discussion against the civil society, claiming that civil society are dependent, financed by foreign donors, and going against national interests. We have a new term, Russian will understand, Sarasyata, somebody who is supported by Soros. And the wars, we have now legal act, draft legal act in the parliament that requires that the NGOs working on foreign money have to be labeled as such, and yeah, should be checked, etc., etc. Nothing encouraging.
Thanks very much, Veronika. Olena, do you have any questions for your compatriot there? Olena,
Yes.
you gone?
Yes, it just arrived this particular second. The question on Ukraine is the following: how is the situation around measures against corruption?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Do you want me to discuss it for next hour? So basically, nothing breaking through. We have the final piece, the anti-corruption court imposed, started working about a year ago with no obvious, far-reaching result. We have now huge accusations that, for example, the Bureau of Investigations is supposed to investigate some top crimes, is actually acting as a tool going against opposition. There's huge scandals and the double change in the head. And recently, NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, is also in a big scandal related to the accusations that they are not impartial. So the only positive thing that the parliament, under the huge pressure from IMF, voted for the so-called anti-Kolomoisky law prohibiting the national bank to return, or prohibiting courts, prohibiting everybody to return nationalized banks to the owners. They can be compensated if they win courts, but they cannot get their banks back. And already this law was used by the Supreme Court to defend in the case related to Privat. So that works, and that is important. But in general, I would not say that we have a huge change. I would say the situation is worse now with, for example, public procurement getting much more accusations in medical sphere, with the new ideas that we need to change the public procurement law to protect domestic producers, localization issues, and some. So it's going wrong direction now, from my point.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, let's move a little bit to the west now, to Minsk. Andrei, we observe in Belarus Lukashenko joining implicitly with Bolsonaro and Trump in being a pandemic denier. This is catching up on them now, like indeed in the US and Brazil as well. So, and now with Lukashenko facing his 10th presidential re-election in August, is he getting into big trouble now?
Yes, it could be, I don't think about big trouble, but some trouble for Lukashenko in this situation. Let me show you a small presentation from my side. So, as you see, at the current moment, Belarus is the leader by the total number of infected among the EAP countries, but the overall dynamics of the disease is slowing down now. And this negative situation, in a great extent, is a result of incompetent Belarusian government policy to handle the crisis. From the very beginning, it's took, let's say, very soft approach with no lockdown, no quarantine in schools and universities, and no strict measures of social distancing. The economic consequences of introduction of a lockdown seems to be a greater risk for their government than the risk of spreading of the COVID-19. But on the other hand, the government respond on growing economic crisis caused mainly by the tensions with Russia on oil, and the economic consequences of the COVID-19 was limited as well. From the positive side, we could mention that government organized rather well mobilization of the healthcare system and mass testing of infected. But the most disastrous was the information policy, with the denial of seriousness of epidemic, presentation of the situation as information hysteria, manipulation of statistics on COVID-19 infected people, and death rate. And Lukashenko himself took a tough stance regarding the quarantine measures, organized very irresponsible mass military parade on May 9th, and made a number of odious statements, including some offensive statements about the victims of COVID-19. This resulted in rather negative perception of the government's policy to handle the crisis among the population. From the recent opinion polls data provided just for our seminar by the Belarusian Analytical Workroom, this is June data, we can see growing distrust to the government in what it takes care of its citizens. We have about 24% of population who completely do not trust the government, and another 22% that rather do not trust. And on the question, do you think the reaction of the Belarusian government to the current outbreak of coronavirus is appropriate, excessive, or insufficient? The majority of the population, 55% of them, answered that the reaction was insufficient. Population in general would like to see fundamentally different approach from the government, in particular the ban on mass events, the improvement of information on COVID-19, the introduction of quarantine in universities and schools, and the maximum transfer of people to the remote work. With the combination of growing economic crisis, this resulted in some important political implications for the Belarusian political situation. And while Lukashenko's authoritarian regime maintained full political control, his image was seriously damaged, and population protest sentiments grew. This has a significant impact on the ongoing electoral campaign for upcoming presidential election in August. Alternative candidates, especially newcomers to the politics who do not represent the traditional opposition, has rapidly gaining support. And in efforts somehow to limit this explosive growth of popularity of the opponents, the Lukashenko's regime arrested two headliners of the electoral campaign, the popular YouTube blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky and the former banker Viktor Babarika. And just yesterday, it blocked the participation of former high-tech park head Valery Tsipkala. So By the election day, such dynamics is likely to lead to mass street protests. And as usually it happened in Belarus, it could possible be mass repressions against the participants of the street protests. And just as a final conclusion, I can say that at the moment, the regime is still stable and controls the political situation, but political turbulence is growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you especially for the beautiful clarity of your slides and your images. I was very struck by the two pie charts. The one on the general trust factor was split almost perfectly 50-50. Whereas the second slide about more specific corona measures, it was not a 50-50 question. It was a distinct majority for dissatisfaction. Olena, anything specific for Andre?
No, we don't have, just unless we just received a second ago.
No?
No,
Oh.
no specific question on Belarus.
Okay. So, shall we move on now to Natalia Yarashevich, who has joined us for the first time. Very welcome. She is Director of the Secretariat of the Civil Society Forum of the Eastern Partnership in Brussels. She also knows Belarus fairly well too, I believe. So anyway, what's your overview of this panorama, Natalia?
Thank you very much, Michael, and I would like to welcome all the participants of this webinar on behalf of organizers, co-organizers as well. Happy to be here as a discussant. So I have read the contributions of experts from 6 Eastern Partnership countries that Michael mentioned were elaborated for the seminar and will be published tomorrow. So, and I'm happy to share with you some observations of mine, more on the multi-country regional perspective and maybe from the perspective of rights and freedoms as well. So the first thing, of course, that jumps out is this characterization of the actions of the government are as totally incompetent, catastrophic, and even chaotic. So this was concerning all the countries but Georgia, but we have heard from Tamara that there are caveats there as well. And the time might show, but when the economic crisis will start, the assessment of the actions of the Georgian government may decrease a bit, but so far it has been quite well. So, and it's only, probably such an assessment is quite gloomy, but it's only natural because globally we have seen that mostly countries, different countries of different levels of developments have been struggling to tackle this challenge of COVID. So it remains to be seen and to be researched how, let's say, the actions of the Eastern Partnership governments could have been improved and what are the lessons learned. So this is to be seen. But in terms of the bad performance, already now we can say that the existing problems existing from quite some time ago led to such a dire performance. I mean, the absence of rule of law, disrespect of human rights and freedoms, ineffective governance in general, corruption, low public trust of societies towards their government. So this all kind of exacerbated, was exacerbated by COVID crisis and affected the ability of the governments to take actions and to address the crisis. What is also interesting is that the modest progress of the countries that have already done in terms of transforming towards more democratic societies may actually become stalled, and the necessary stability of regimes for implementing the reforms can also be gone. So the pace of reforms now and in the future will be quite difficult to maintain. Also, in terms of trade-off between measures taken to combat COVID and human rights and freedoms, we have also seen this trade-off globally. So most of the countries struggled to respect human rights and freedoms, while the special measures have been imposed to combat the pandemic. And of course, quite some big trade-offs have been made in this regard in the Eastern Partnership countries. So 5 countries have imposed different types of states of emergencies or quarantine regime or emergency situations. And of course, there were quite some questions in terms of proportionality and constitutionality of imposition of those regimes. And this aspect remains to be monitored because, of course, those regimes should be time limited. In terms of another area that stood out quite starkly was freedom of expression and media. So there we know censure was almost introduced in Armenia and Moldova. So in Moldova, it was a very successful case when the civil society and activists repealed the law that was introducing the censure with regard to the COVID-related information. It was done in 36 hours, as far as I remember. So it was quite a success. In terms of Armenia, it took a bit more time, a bit less than a month, and then progressively in some steps, these measures have also been repealed due to the actions of civil society. In Azerbaijan, the situation was not so good. So the amendments to information law have been introduced, which basically obliged the owners of internet portals to ensure that they are not providing the false information. And people are already being charged based on this law, and there are concerns that this law will continue to be applied even when the state of emergency in Azerbaijan, special quarantine regime, will be lifted. Another, let's say, concerning area is the access to information. So it has become difficult for journalists and public in all 6 Eastern Partnership countries. The extensions were given to the governments to provide the information in response to requests for information. As several speakers mentioned, there is little transparency about how decisions about COVID measures are being taken. They're not particularly explained. There is no transparency on who takes which particular decisions. So this remains a concern. And low level of trust to statistics, COVID-related statistics, has also been identified as a concerning matter. Extremely low level of statistics in Belarus, Azerbaijan, and to a certain level in Moldova. And of course, this issue raises issues internally of how the measures are developed and are they really effective? But there is another aspect to it, which is external, because it might become a problem when it comes to decisions on which countries will be open for travel for the Eastern Partnership countries. So will other countries be relying on the statistics of some Eastern Partnership countries? So this is a bit questionable. And then moving on to another area of from the rights perspective, right to peaceful assembly. Currently, it's restricted in all Eastern Partnership countries but Georgia. The restriction was lifted, I think, second half of May there. So, and this restriction is especially worrying due to the flurry of legislative acts that are being adopted by the parliaments, and also because of ongoing and upcoming electoral campaigns in a number of Eastern Partnership countries. So I'm finishing with the stability of regimes. We have heard quite detailed explanation on those. So my take on this is that crisis basically has made quite unstable situations in the region even more unstable. So we are expecting further protests and violent dispersals in Belarus. Azerbaijan public is becoming more and more critical towards actions of the government and abandoning self-imposed self-censorship. So in Moldova, we heard about fragmented legislature and attempts to collapse the government. In Ukraine and Armenia, since the popularity of the leaders are still quite high, but it's going down, and the expectations of the populations in terms of the promised achievements are not met. So, and in Georgia, the situation is quite good, but again, there are also complications. It has recently come out of this electoral political stalemate with regard to the electoral system, and it will already be trying it in October very soon. So to sum up, it seems that the situation remains quite worrying and needs to be monitored closely. Because COVID exacerbates already existing problems, making them worse, and the situation deteriorates, becomes less stable, and it will become even less stable in autumn when the effects of economic crisis will be felt. So on this not very positive note, I will finish.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So we've got almost a quarter of an hour now for more general debate. So Olena, can you help steer this by selecting questions to throw open?
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you, all panelists. To be honest, I was expecting some hope, more hope than has been presented. So with regard to the questions, so definitely Georgia, for this or other reason, is the heat of the season today. Tamara, you may see the questions in the Q&A, and many of them are directed to Georgia. So given the constraints of time, probably you could maybe write down the answers there. And for the panelists, we would take all of the general questions, and they're quite interesting. So these are concerning the all region of the Eastern Partnership countries. And here are the questions. The first question is from Alexandru Murjat. Any particular expectations for Eastern Partnership countries from the German chairmanship in the European Union in the next 6 months? So this is question number one to everyone. The second question is with regards from Anna Melinchuk, and it's a very quite interesting question, probably which many of us ask ourselves as well. So the question is with regards of political and human rights implications of the digital measures introduced during COVID-19 in some of the Eastern Partnership countries. 4 Eastern Partnership governments, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine, launched citizens tracking applications to curb the spread of the virus. And at the same time, there is a risk that personal data collected by these applications could be used for purposes other than COVID-19. And the question is, what are the experiences with these applications so far? Are the governments of Eastern Partnership countries using sensitive personal data of its citizens responsibly? So this is the question regarding these digital tools. And the third question, by the way, it's already the second time that we have environmental questions with regard to the Eastern Partnership country. The first webinar we also had this question, and this is from Zinovi Broida. how do you see nowadays Eastern Partnership answer on European Green Deal and appropriate EU new generation challenges? With inter alia are very close concerned COVID-19 issues. So these are the questions to all panelists, and I hope we have enough time to tackle them. Give the floor to panelists. Who would like to start?
I can
May I
start.
start? Okay.
Because it's maybe simple for me to answer, because the current political situation in Belarus could be developed to their situation of their mass repressions during electoral day or after the election day in August 9th. So we can't have for now particular expectations from Germany, for example, chairmanship in this situation. Their expectations could be about the general situation, what will be after this possible development of the situation. Will European Union introduce sanctions against Belarusian regime again, and this will lead to their new freezing of situation or not? And the situation with their environmental issues and cooperation about the Green Deal, in the situation of freezing in almost all important sectoral issues as well could be stopped at the level of cooperation with European Union.
Okay, I'll have a go.
Okay, maybe I will try to have short answers regarding the tracing apps. The law which allowed government to get information from mobile phones or GPS tracing was adopted on March 31, and it was huge controversy, and government was telling in parliament this is the only way to save lives or to prevent the growth of viruses, giving us examples of Singapore, South Korea, etc. But interestingly, when this law was adopted, we have daily new cases for 40 and 50. Now, for last 1 month, for example, starting from mid-May, for last 45 days, now Armenia has 10 times more daily cases, 500, 600, even 700 daily cases. And interestingly, now it's only some opposition figures are asking the government that, okay, can we say that this law and the use of tracing apps failed? Because after the adoption of this law and using this tracing app, we had exponential growth of a virus. And the second issue is, okay, if this had failed, why we are not going to stop it? Because till now the law is in force, so government has access to the information through mobile phones. But again, this not only didn't prevent the growth, but Armenia experienced exponential growth of cases starting from end of April. So this is an open question because government does not say anything about the law. Did it help? And if it didn't help, why it was so? And if it was useless, why government put much more emphasis to adopt this law on March 31? And regarding any expectations from Germany's upcoming or starting EU Council presidency till end of this year, in Armenia, I don't think we have any concrete expectations regarding the Armenia or Eastern Partnership. Maybe some expert circles here are thinking if Germany, in line with France, could think about somehow to initiate or launch some negotiations with Russia on Russia-EU relations in this former Soviet Union territories, given the France recent actions to somehow start the normalization process with Russia. We know that 2 or 3 days ago there was a long discussion between President Putin and President Macron. Again, there we're speaking about the new security architecture in Europe. So mainly Armenian, at least expert circles, are thinking that if Macron was speaking not only on behalf of France, but also on behalf of Germany, if not on behalf of EU, and we see any steps towards the launching of some, if not normalization process, at least launching of some negotiations between EU and Russia regarding their relations in the European part of former Soviet Union.
I have one, Andrei. Before we switch to another speaker, I would like to draw your attention. There are some particular questions on Belarus in the Q&A session. Maybe you can tackle them in the Q&A window. Thanks.
Okay.
Well, Olena, I'll just say, not on Belarus, but on more general, there was one question about Eastern Partnership in 10 years' time, right? I think one can say a few things about that. One is what will be the EU-Russia relationship in 10 years' time in ways that might have incidence on the Eastern Partnership. Well, Mr. Putin is getting his constitution voted, he hopes, on the 5th, I think, of July, which if that's passed, it sets him in for another 15 years, more even than the 10 years. If that is the case, I think on the European Union side, there would be just a sober zero expectation of important changes. Just a standoff, the present standoff will continue. Now, in that situation, how will the 6 Eastern partners react? I think there's some scope for more of what we may call the Armenian model of finding unilaterally or bilaterally some kind of balanced concordat with both sides. Okay, we've seen how that has happened, and that is an interesting development. Still to be tested, I would say, on the EU side as to what the new agreement really is going to translate to in practice, which is not clear. There's a lot of detail in that agreement, but it's, whether the Pashinyan team are serious in implementing it is not clear to me. Maybe it is to Benyamin. Then, would there be variants on this model? Well, of course, Moldova is in principle well placed to do that, although it's tilting heavily with Dodon towards Moscow in terms of geopolitical rhetoric. Nonetheless, the economic realities are very heavily weighed in favor of Europe. So one certainly could imagine that somehow Moldova manages a balance in this regard. Now, with respect to the others, well, Ukraine, of course, is blocked in this respect with respect to the standoff in the Minsk agreement over the Donbass. Although Zelensky wants to do some kind of deal, so there seems to be some demand on the political Ukrainian side to move in this direction, but under what conditions is the outstanding issue. Well, I won't go on. There are variants on this theme that can be developed in all 6 of the 6 of the countries. There was one question that you didn't mention, Olena, but I saw on the screen as to what expectations should there be of the new German presidency of the Council of the EU with respect to the Eastern Partnership.
No, I put this question. Okay.
So, to my mind, there's a rather simple and easy answer to that question. The German presidency is overwhelmingly prioritizing negotiation over the coronavirus recovery package, this trillion-euro package. And right now, there are incredibly intense negotiations going on between France and Germany on the one hand, and who are flanked with, on the one hand, the southerners, Greece, Spain, and Portugal, Italy, who absolutely want this package fast, and then a group of 4 smaller countries led by the Netherlands who are trying to play hard to get over this. Now, Merkel is presently, and Macron, they tried to negotiate through some kind of solution. Anyway, this is a very complex passage, and so it will certainly take at least 6 months to get clarity on that. And then on the other side, the Eastern Partnership, what we've observed is that with the inability to hold a real summit in July, the can has been kicked down the road to March of next year, when there is planned a serious summit. As regards the German presidency, they will heave a bit of a sigh of relief, saying, thank you very much, that's one that we don't have to worry about, that's for our successor. Maybe I'm being a little bit on the political side there, but I guess that's the story. Denis is there sitting, although he's Mr. Moldova, he's sitting actually in Germany and may have a view on that too.
I will be very quick. I support Michael's realism about what Germany can do. And if we check out the program of the trio presidency that Germany is going to share with Slovenia and Portugal, you will see that actually the German side is really looking forward to start many initiatives, including the one on rule of law mechanism, which is very important for the future of the multi-financial framework to 21-27. So apart from that, Germany also in that document is promising to support our region, 6 EAP countries, to exit from the COVID-19 pandemic. Which is a big statement. So it means that we will see not only let's say humanitarian aid, because I think that Moldova and maybe some other countries will end up to ask for that support, because in my view we are dealing with governments incapable to solve issues by themselves. So we will probably need external intervention in order to help those governments. On the issue of Armenian model, I remember that starting from 2018, I was speaking about the Armenian model that Moldova could use in the future, which was done by Igor Dodon, who pushed the country to join as an observer country the Eurasian Union. And by the way, he just had several weeks ago the meeting, the virtual meeting of the heads of the Eurasian Union's countries meeting. So he was just listening and maybe some reporting, but he is already involved in the communication at the highest level with the heads of the Eurasian Union states. And last but not least, on the proposal of opening the borders of the EU to our region countries, which is already something done for Georgia, though it should be reciprocated, as Tamara told us. I'm just reading now on Twitter that Italy is opting out from these recommendations of the EU Council and is going to keep the strict restrictions. So we should understand that we are speaking about more dispersed opinions within the ecosystem of EU institutions. So the EU Council makes recommendations for the European Commission, but now during COVID, we saw that there is a lot of unilateral decisions and divisions inside the European Union. So I think that Michael is totally right that Germany will try to actually focus all its energy to create this consolidated positions on priority issues, and definitely the recovery plan is one of those priorities. Thank you.
Actually, just to add to this, the Czech Republic also opted out of this decision about resumption of flights, and they said that they will not open the border to Georgia, even though there was this EU-wide decision. But Georgia is not opening borders anyway, so it doesn't change anything for now.
If I may add very quickly about priority for the German presidency, yeah, indeed, it seems that it will be COVID related, but on the other hand, it's Germany who will be preparing, working with the EU member states to prepare the declaration for the next Eastern Partnership Summit and the next framework, which means the new deliverables for the Eastern Partnership. And those will guide the concrete steps on which the Eastern Partnership will be focusing. So I think it's very important for Germany to ensure that all stakeholders are involved into this process, and that indeed the countries are receiving quite interesting offer that there is a new boost to the Eastern Partnership, and at the same time, yeah, really figuring out with conditionality how to push forward the countries to reform, those ones that are undemocratic, and what to offer to those ones that are willing to step forward in terms of integration with the EU. I think it's quite a big deal.
But just a small opinion from my side about this conditionality and other techniques that the EU has at its hands and could be using them in order to make the reforms actually work out. I think that we are somehow operating with the same concepts, and we are just trying to pack them in new formulations. But in my view, and I wrote about that yesterday, I sent to everybody that piece of mine. I think that what is really necessary to do is to work on what is already done, definitely, but we need more accountability about the finances that the EU is using. We need more auditing of the finances that the EU is providing to each of the countries. It should be a mechanism established for each of the 6 countries. We should know how money are spent and why they're not spent properly, or which are the. We should increase the number of, in general, staffing of the EU institutions that work on our regions, both on the region and individual countries. And last but not least, I strongly believe that universalization of what I call universalization of the conditionality principle should apply both for the macro-financial assistance and for all other types of finances. Because right now it's only macro-financial, which allows the EU to speak about political preconditions and sectoral conditionality, while I believe that we need to push for more conditionality in all types of support that the EU is offering to the countries from our region.
Okay. Maybe I add one more point. I know we're overshooting for time, so we should conclude. But on the Eastern Partnership, more explicitly, looking ahead, let's just say medium term, 5 to 10 years, there is the double motto of the whole business is inclusiveness of the 6 and differentiation, which accommodates the association agreements with the 3. The question is the balance between the 2, and what we clearly observe as of now is that the 3 associates, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, are wanting to change a bit the balance between inclusiveness and differentiation. That is to say, they would like to accentuate to some degree more the specific status of the 3 associates. This has not received a positive reaction from the EU institutions as of now, but it is a serious argument that it is on the table, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were not, let's say, relatively discreet ways found to do this, because there's so much substance, economic as well as political substance, in the 3 association agreements that there are objective needs for those 3 to be dialoguing explicitly with the EU institutions on how to update and further develop those relationships. So at a lower level, if you like, of strategic significance, I would say that is one thing to watch. Okay, Olena, I think it's time for us to conclude and to go and do whatever we want for the rest of the day. I'd like to thank everybody, particularly the number of people. I don't know how the number is and where they are and who they are, or the others beyond the half dozen faces we can say here. But thank you very much to all of you out there who we don't really know, but we thank you very much for joining us. And thanks again to our 6 contributors of the written papers. And I'd like to underline that you will have available on www.3DCFTAs.eu all of these papers under the heading of bulletin number 6 tomorrow. So there we are. Bye-bye to everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
That's great.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.